Okay, so we're going to get started. A couple of housekeeping things. There will be some time for questions at the end. And if you do ask a question, there are two mics in the aisles here. Please use those because we're recording the lecture tonight and we want to record your question. A couple of other things. Glass is very important at MIT. Maybe those of you from not at MIT may not realize that, but just to give you an idea, today, completely independent of this, I was corresponding with Jamie Carpenter, who was a previous Hazlegrove lecturer, and I told him that Toots was here tonight to speak, and he goes, "Oh gosh, I wish I could be there." But you know, you might tell people that I'm giving a lecture Thursday night at MIT. You can believe that. Talk about Toots and Jamie go back to the early 70s, I guess. Is that right? So, I mean, very early days of glass art in the United States, really. Tonight's event marks the 20th year since we've been, at least the concept of the lectures, Hazlegrove lecture started, because Paige passed away in '97. And this lecture honors her contribution to the arts at MIT, and we've been doing it every year. There's a long list of glass artists that we've invited to MIT, and this is, we've waited too long to invite Toots tonight. Toots Zynsky is our speaker. She's
still alive.
Still alive, a Boston native. You know, I was mentioning to Toots earlier, I'd gone over her bio to prepare this, and it said Pilchuck 1971, and I thought, God, did it even exist then? And of course, that was the first year, and I realized that I had this vision in my head that it was really just a bunch of hippies in the forest at that point, and it was. Followed by a degree at RISD in '73. We're really talking about the earliest days of American glass art movement. She has many, many awards, too long to even begin to list. I just noted a very recent one, Masters of the Medium Award, which is a craft art award by the James Renswick Alliance. I think that's the same family that did the Renswick Gallery at the Smithsonian. I believe so.
It's actually part of the Smithsonian.
It's part of the Smithsonian, that's right. And previous winners of that are known to many people around MIT and the glass arts: Lino Tagliapietra, Dan Daly, Dale Chihuly, all those kind of folks were previous winners of that award, and I think that's a 2017 award. So this is very recent. So you can add the Hazlegrove lecture to your list of very impressive awards. Host of other international awards, numerous residencies, 2016 at the Corning Residency in Specialty Glass. Her work is just in a huge number of public collections that include MoMA, MFA, Smithsonian, down the list. If you follow glass art for a while, you will recognize just how influential she's been to many younger artists. Many younger artists have, been inspired by her craft and her approach to making glass pieces. So it's really a great honor to have you here tonight to tell us about your work, and really welcome to MIT.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm actually preceding my lecture tonight with a news flash from yesterday, which some of you may have heard about. I'm from Rhode Island now, so this is deeply touches me, and it's a larger issue too. And the headline is, the EPA cancels talk on climate change by agency scientists. So the Environmental Protection Agency canceled the speaking appearance of 3 scientists who were scheduled to discuss climate change at a conference yesterday. And those scientists were barred from speaking And they had contributed substantial material to a 400-page report, which was presented. So, many of us, and I'm sure some of you out there, have been working for the past few years to add the A in art to the STEM requirements across the country and turn it into STEAM and power it. So it looks like we now all have to be sure that the S for science isn't taken away from that acronym. So pay attention to what's happening, because it's really happening. First, I want to thank MIT and Peter Hauk and the Glass Lab for inviting me tonight. I'm always happy to be back where I was born, and this is a special honor to give the Paige Hazlegrove lecture this year. I didn't know Paige. I was living in Europe during the time she emerged as a significant artist in my field. But I did have the pleasure of drawing her into the Corning New Glass Review in 1996. I thought she was a very special talent. So I also want to thank the Hazlegrove family for endowing this lecture series in her memory. So don't let the title of this lecture deceive you. We are using the word engineering in the full broad sense of the term, as in application of science to design, building, and use of machines, etc., to move or drive something, to continue or bring about. And remember that the word engineer is derived from the word ingenuity. So I do want to emphasize here that technical aspects are not my focus with my work, although I do have a great fascination and always have with science and engineering. They've largely been a necessity to enable me to create the work that I want to create. And I have no secrets about my work, so I don't believe in that. So I've prepared the lecture tonight really on the evolution of my work, and I do believe in evolution as opposed to divine intervention. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself and my sort of early childhood and ongoing relationship with MIT, which has been sort of random dancing in and out, but I clearly remember my parents bringing me in to see the Saarinen Chapel and the Kresge Auditorium, which was one of the sort of early marvels of architecture that I had the pleasure to experience. So for those of you who haven't been there, definitely don't leave this world without doing it. It's an amazing space, particularly the chapel. I also had a funny relationship with MIT because one of my earliest childhood friends, and until I was 19, was a professor from Tufts University who had been my mother's mathematics professor. She was apparently one of his favorite students, so he became an ever-present presence in our life growing up. He loved music, I loved music, we shared that. He was also Norbert Wiener's professor. And so that was my earliest connection with MIT when I learned that. He had gone to Tufts instead of MIT as an 11-year-old because to go to Tufts, he didn't have to cross the train tracks, which he would have to come to MIT. So he did wind up here later, and I know he's a legend here. You know, all of that started really inspiring me as a child. So you'll see that music, which I just mentioned, has figured all through my life. It's also been a big influence in my own work and creativity. Let me see. So the first image I'm going to show you may surprise you or may not. It's the Hubble telescope. So I think this is one of the largest castings of glass ever made. I saw the first flawed telescope or glass component of the telescope when I visited Corning when I was at Rhode Island School of Design. It's an absolute marvel of engineering, technology, science, and I think it's a beautiful work of art. I also mention it because my brother was on the team that had to figure out how to correct this. Once they had launched it into space, they realized that the curve didn't work. It had been miscalculated. So what they were getting was what was on the left. And someone on my brother's team said, wait a minute, we could correct this. Let's try and put something that he related to a pair of eyeglasses on it. So they created CoStar, which has corrective optic space telescope axial replacement, which was then sent up and put in place by some astronauts. So it's really my brother you should have invited here tonight. So I decided when I was 11 years old that I wanted to go to Rhode Island School of Design because I heard it was the best art school in the country. And although I was very serious playing piano, by the time I was 11, I realized I couldn't compose. And that was the end for me. I continued to play, but then I turned away from pursuing that as, a career or whatever. And I did go to Rhode Island School of Design, and I was just very lucky because the year that I landed there, by coincidence, was the year that they hired Dale Chihuly, who many of you know, to start a glass program on campus at the school. Jamie Carpenter was one of the students. I was one of the students. And in '71, we all went out to Pilchuck, and Dale asked us to come out and help him build a school. So we went, yeah, why not? So the only way to learn about glass at that time was glass blowing. That was all that was offered. We had a very small space. But Dale was very encouraging, and everyone came from different disciplines, so we brought different attitudes to the material, and we just wanted to try everything. So I did learn how to blow glass, and I still think it's one of the best ways to really acquire a deep understanding of the behavior of this amazing material. But I quickly became frustrated just working a blowpipe, and I started pouring it and using blown forms and sticking them together, and then just pouring it and pulling it up with metal rods and just kind of exploring the whole capability it has for freezing motion, freezing liquid motion. And then I wanted to go further. I wanted to work with glass in a larger way. So these are early pieces that I made in 1972. I'm sorry, the slides from those days were not very good but what happened was that my intention was to use this to create the illusion of draping material using glass. And when I installed it and lit it and stepped back from it, you actually 10 feet away couldn't tell what was the physical material and what was the reflection. It all just looked like reflections. The importance of unexpected results is important, I think, in the sciences. It's important, certainly, in the arts and probably many other fields. It's important to just really look at what's in front of you and what's happened and learn from it every day. I think it was the brilliant painter Chuck Close who said, inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just have to show up and go to work. Everything grows out of that work, and it opens new doors, and you go down through that door and you discover more things. So I've always been very fascinated by sound, and anybody who's worked in a hot glass shop knows that you're always hearing glass breaking, and whether it's dropping on the floor or, shattering in a water bin or whatever. And I started realizing that they were actually kind of perfect musical tones. And I also wanted to know why glass broke, and that sounds sort of maybe very primary, but it's always been considered a very negative quality of the material. And I kept looking at it and going, it's such an important aspect of the material that it must have something more important about it. It must mean something. There's so much going on in there. And so luckily, a guy named Buster Simpson, who's a fantastic artist, came to town to RISD And he had video equipment. No one had video equipment then. This is in early 1973. Even RISD didn't have its own video equipment. They were borrowing it from a private owner. And so Buster said, sure. So we started purposely thermal shocking glass to find out what was going on. And then that wasn't enough. So we applied contact microphones so we could hear what was actually going on inside the glass. And what we were hearing was these perfect musical tones just shooting across the glass. And sometimes they weren't appearing as physical cracks. So we took these infrared still photos concurrent with the videos to just learn more about the heat that was transferring. And oddly, that last pane of glass never broke. And there was no logical reason that it shouldn't have. So I kept going with that for quite a while and learning a lot. And then I finished at RISD, and I had the opportunity, out of the clear blue sky, to participate in the building of an authentic Japanese house on Martha's Vineyard. And because my dad was a builder and a fine woodworker, I had actually grown up doing that. And so it seemed like a great idea. So for 2 years, during the building season, I participated in the building of this house. And when the architect found out that I knew how to finish wood, he put me to work from the roof all the way through the whole house. So I actually finished the wood on every square inch of this house. And it was a really important learning experience that I've carried through today in my studio practice, because every day they cleaned up the entire site for half an hour and then went fishing right down at the ocean. We all went fishing. And then in the morning, we started fresh. There wasn't a curl of sawdust or wood shaving on the floor. And it's a really great way to start the day with all your fresh energy in a clean space and the satisfaction of looking what you accomplished the day before instead of, coming into a mess. So much thanks to Lisa Taylor, who was the co-owner with her husband of this house and the founding director, National Museum of Design in New York City. Being the only 2 women most of the time on the site, we kind of bonded, and she really encouraged me a lot to get back to my own work. And they offered my then husband a job in New York after the project was finished. So we moved to New York, which was someplace I had never, ever wanted to move to. But I luckily met Joe Upham, who's here tonight, and joined the New York Experimental Glass Workshop. And I started again working with the last thing I worked with, but in a different form, and that was thermal shocking glass. So everything you see here began as 2 very similar pieces, made slightly off timing with each other. So one was cooled down, and then I blew the other one into it. So it thermal shocked away what it would and kept stuck to what it would. So there's a certain purity about the whole process that I really enjoyed. I actually started doing these thread pieces, and this is a seminal piece to the rest of my work in so many ways. Because when I was in Vermont, I was fascinated by these giant rolls of barbed wire that were just sort of kicking around in the landscape, rusting away, and I actually did some work with them. I thought, well, maybe I could do something with glass and start wrapping it around itself. And then I, for the first time, worked with color. It was kind of a random desire just to make a black and red piece. And the black and red is actually completely fractured, as are the ones on the right, because in those days, compatibility was a huge issue with color. And we're still talking about the early days of the studio glass movement. This is in the early 80s, late 79, 80. And so when I kept working with it, so I abandoned that for a while, but I had become fascinated with the threads, because there were always threads all over the floor after we were doing it. And I just started playing with them and realizing that I could create this volume if I just fused them together just at the right moment. Then I started combining fusing mats of glass thread onto blown forms. So it meant, working in a kiln and then blowing and then, combining them at just the right moment so the heat was right, because hot glass doesn't stick to cold glass. And I returned a bit to slumping, and I don't know if you can see because the lights are so bright in here, but again, when I installed this piece on the wall, and I have this fascination with nailing glass to walls, I don't know why, but what happened is that frame, which is a solid pâte de verre glass frame, was wide enough and deep enough that when the piece was lit, the shadow inside was red. I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but the shadow outside was pretty much just gray. And I started really understanding more about light and how light bounces and is sort of trapped even though it's in open space. So these pieces were all part of my first cellar. And again, sort of strange ways of torching glass around a blown piece, and finally the one on the right, which was the first piece that I made exclusively with crushed threads. And that piece is in the Corning Museum, and that's how I first really met the people at the Corning Museum. And because of this show, I also met an inventor artist named Matthias Turnesen van Manen, who was visiting New York, and friends of friends had said, oh, you have to see Toots and her show. So he went up to see the show, and I was very shy about my work. And he said, well, how do you make this? I'd love to see it. So because I was at New York Experimental Glass Workshop right downtown, he came down the next day and watched us sticking up hot blobs of glass together on, at the end of steel rods and running in opposite directions. And he kind of kept watching in amazement and finally said, this is really medieval, And I sort of looked at what we were doing. I went, yeah, you're right. This is how it's been done since medieval times. And he said, well, you could probably make a machine that would do this. So he disappeared for 24 hours and came back, and he'd made this contraption that looked like a Rube Goldberg invention, but it actually could feed glass. The basic concept behind it is that it feeds glass rods through a double burner flame, pulls it over enough space, which is about 1 meter, to cool it down so it holds its shape taut, and then has an automatic cutting mechanism. That's just basically what it does. So it seemed like a good idea. And I called up Corning, and they let us have a day with one of their engineers who, explained a lot to us about pulling fiber optics. And some of it was applicable, a lot of it not, because it's such a different kind of glass. But I had also discovered through Gianni Toso, the Italian artist who some of you may know, he came to the workshop as a guest, and he had these amazing, amazing rods of color, the likes of which none of us had ever seen. And he said, oh, you have to go to Milette, it's in Venice. And I said, no, it sounds like a plan. And I'd just gotten a small NEA grant, which no longer exists, unfortunately, for emerging artists, but it really was what gave me the leg up and got me through the whole next year of experimentation when everything broke. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this. So I went to Europe and first went to Holland and discovered this really thriving contemporary art scene. Then to Milan, where I encountered this great collision of the new and the very, very old. That's the Duomo in the background from the hotel. And then, of course, to Venice, which to this day, as many hundred times as I've been there, is still a marvel and a dream to me. And I found the colored glass rods I was looking for. So this is actually back in my studio. I have a pretty big stock of it. And this is, I'm sort of running through some more technical stuff than I usually do at a lecture since I'm here at MIT. So I'll go quickly. So this is just basically where you see the rod being fed through a double flame. What you see on the left is part of an electronic eye. Matthias Turnesen van Manen was a brilliant man and knew everything about electronics and mechanics. He didn't know anything about glass. I knew about glass and mechanics, and his brother was a sound and software engineer. So the machine has very special software that coordinates the feeding mechanism, so it feeds the rod through the flames at an adjustable rate, a very finely adjustable rate. The electronic eye, which was my idea, reads the level of the thread, and then with the electronics raises an arm or lowers it so that the thread is at the right level, because what Matthias didn't know was that glass, different colorants in the same body of glass give it different plasticities. And some of the rods which were pulled by hand are thicker and thinner, so that no one had to be standing there watching the machine and adjusting it every 5 seconds. The electronic eye accomplishes that. So those are the two machines. They're actually each 20 feet long. You see the rods standing there ready to be pulled. The rolling pulling mechanism that just continually pulls the thread. And this, for you MIT brainiacs, is one of the magic boxes. This is the first magic box. Joe Upham said I had to put it in the lecture. This is the first magic box. There's Joe cleaning it out. And there's the original electronics. And I'm of the school of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So this still runs one of the machines. And I have a fun attachment to it, actually. This is a later magic box. And that's later electronics, which now still looks like Dinosaur era. But what it all does is give me bundles and bundles and bundles of glass thread that's very fine and very straight, which is important because to make the work that I make, glass has surface tension. So if there's a space, and this is a magnification, but even the tiniest of spaces between the rods, as much as you melt it, it won't run together. It's going to keep running apart. So they have to be straight in order to work. I was very hesitant about working with color in the very beginning. I had never really worked with very much color. So I started very simply. And I had never studied color formally at RISD. And I'd had some early compatibility issues. And it was simply because I'd gone to the wrong Moretti. And the one that I had gone to actually had glass from 5 different makers, so they were made from 5 different formulas. So when they were melted together, they cracked apart. They have what's called, for those of you who don't know, a coefficient of expansion. Is in very simple basic terms, it's the rate at which a substance contracts or expands as it heats and cools. So, if one glass is cooling at a different rate, and shrinking faster, it's going to pull apart from the glass next to it that is cooling and shrinking at a slower rate. So I was, when I started combining colors, I did it very, very hesitantly, and stripes were a good way to start because, if there's something wrong, it's going to break right along that stripe. And then I went back, when I discovered the problem, I went back to the right Moretti, and then I had no problems anymore. At about that time, I was living in Amsterdam, and African music was coming to Amsterdam constantly. Every week there was music, and we were fascinated by it, and just sort of started fantasizing a project. And then we were able to actually realize that project thanks to the brother, again, of Matthias, who was the sound engineer, and Sony had sent him the first portable digital recording equipment, which is really perfect for African music because it had never been recorded except on analog, and that has a much narrower dynamic range. So the softer sounds and the more dynamic drumming sounds were sacrificed. With digital, that doesn't happen. And so we thought, well, we could take that equipment to Africa, and it runs off a 12-volt car battery, and we could record music digitally. So we did, and it was fantastic. So there we are. My son was 10 years old, and we were invited to amazing events. It was just post-revolutionary, and the Minister of Culture gave us a pass to the whole country, and we were some of the only non-Ghanaians in the country during that time. They were wonderfully welcoming, and my whole sense of time was affected by being in Africa, and I kind of craved that sense of time because these days that were absolutely full of activity and full of wonder seemed endless. And although we were only there for half a year, it really seemed more like 2 years. But the great thing that happened, I didn't go there to do my work. I went there to get away from my work. I went there to be confronted with something larger, and I didn't know what it was, but it was about other ideas and how other people on other continents in completely different cultures thought about life and about the world. What happened when I came back, I discovered was that my whole sense of color had been totally inspired and liberated. As a young child in first grade, our teacher had a color chart on the wall, and it had red, orange, yellow, and opposite had green, blue, purple, and we were told that you couldn't combine the colors that were opposite each other because they clashed. And it's amazing how much, like a piece of information like that to a young child sticks. You have to be careful what inhibitions you impose upon children because they really do stick. And it took me, it took me going to Africa, getting, malaria and typhoid, and listening to this great music, and looking at all these beautiful textiles that they wear, to have that taken off of my head and out of my soul. So I started just being much more bold with color. I started drawing a lot when I came back, and these drawings are pretty large. They're not as large as the screen, they're about half as large. And it, obviously fed into my work. I don't ever draw the pieces that I'm gonna make because the act of making them is so similar to the same mental activity as doing a drawing or a painting that the work in glass would become secondary and lose that kind of initial excitement and spontaneity. So I'm going to go kind of quickly through these. You can just visually see the development of my work. I had access to amazing museums in Europe that were a bike ride away. And I was able to look at all these incredible works of art right in front of me that I had only seen in books up until then. And I moved from Amsterdam to Paris. And the City of Lights really is a city of lights. It's the most beautiful at night, and all the intersections of the colored lights, and the architecture obviously influenced my work. In '94, I had the opportunity to go back out to Seattle and work with an old team from Pilchuck of great friends, and was able to finally make those early pieces in a much larger scale. So it seemed just like a nice, pleasurable opportunity. And I love touching base again at regular intervals with hot glass in the form of glass blowing and that kind of activity and that kind of team activity. It has a real parallel in dance. And this kind of constant, spontaneous choreography that goes on in a glassblowing studio is really one of the things that originally attracted me to it, because I needed to be moving to make it, and that was important. I hadn't been able to figure out another area at RISD that I could possibly major in, because most of it was standing or sitting still, and I've never been very good at that. So this piece is at the Corning Museum. It's large, and it sits on its side like that. But when I went back to my own studio, I got back to my own work. So this is just a basic, how-to. And this is the initial layer of the colored pieces. And the results. And many, many, many returns to Venice. I mean, I'm lucky because my glass rods I make the glass threads from still come from the same company, which is now, though, called Effetri. Venice is just marvelous. And I was there in the winter. It was a very foggy, rainy day. And came back and went back to work in my studio. And it influenced, my choice of colors. And I started elaborating colors. I started understanding more about the relationships between colors. And then I went through a very difficult period of my life And I had to stop working for a while. Over a period of 2 years, I lost 8 people that I dearly loved. And when I was finally able to have the time to come back to my studio, because I've been caretaking several of them, I found that I had no relationship with color anymore. And I was really bewildered. And I thought, well, I just have to calm down and just sit here for a while and look at it. And the more I looked at the color, the less I had anything to do with it or had any feeling of being inspired by it or wanting to do anything with it. And so I thought, well, I need to put on some music. I always listen to music when I work. And I didn't even want to listen to music, and that actually worried me a lot more than not being able to make anything, because I thought, well, I've been at this for, at that point, 35 years. Maybe that's it. You know, maybe that's all I have, and that's more than a lot of artists have had. So, what time for a career change? And that didn't panic me at all. I mean, I've heard of fellow artists who had, you know, artist block, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And I thought, well, maybe this is artist block, but it seemed to be lasting too long. So my son came in the studio and he said, "What's the matter with you?" And I said, I don't know. I don't know what I was ever doing with all this color or why. And he said, "Well, just get back to work." I said, "I don't want to." And he said, "Well, Mom, just make a red piece. You like red. Just do it." And he said, "Here, I'll help you," you know. So we started laying out this red piece, and I liked it. But I still, since then, have never really gotten that sense of color back. I keep hoping it'll come back. A doctor talked to me about it and said, "Well, you know, so you should really learn more about chromesthesia and synesthesia." And I said, "Well, I don't even know what that is." And so he explained it to me, and it made sense. I love music. It's always inspired my work, and I started to understand that I started to realize that there's this incredible relationship and parallel between the resonance and harmonics of musical notes combining in the air and the resonance and harmonics of colors as they combine in the air. And I'm sure, you know, when you look at paintings and stand back, you suddenly see colors combining. And it's because they actually are combining in the air. So since then, I started making very simple one color or, you know, very dark to rising up to one color pieces. And I started then working more with the forms and elaborating form instead of color, because I didn't seem to be able to do that anymore. And I started making larger pieces that I needed a new challenge to sort of just jumpstart myself. And so I started making larger and larger pieces and figuring out how to make them. And then once you've made a perfect form, then you can go at it and really do something different to it. And I started sort of crushing them and being more and more happy with the way they were looking. And then I thought I could start working with color again, but it was really only gray, white, and black. But that was getting closer, right? So what happened, though, as I was starting to overlay some opaques with some transparent threads, this wonderful feathering started to happen. And it hadn't been my intention. It was just a wonderful accident that happened with the glass. So this is why it happens. So what you're seeing here are actually the rods. But when these rods are pulled to thread, they look exactly like this, only smaller. They'll always have the same configuration. So on the left is just plain clear glass, and on the right is actually crystal clear glass coating a core of black. So if you read top left to right and start first overlaying them and then start to turn them, you see this very simple optical effect that happens. So I started really applying that and doing it on purpose to get these beautiful feathering effects in my pieces. So here's where I started making the larger pieces that were more stretched. And here's just a basic run-through of how the pieces are made. They all start out flat on a ceramic fiber board with very fine rice paper in between to keep a bed of plaster that it's all on from powdering up into the threads, because then they wouldn't fuse together. And so this is what happens. And although this piece here is transparent glass, it doesn't look transparent, and there's a simple reason for that. So this is just a big magnification of the threads. And this is only 3 layers of them, but those pieces have about 30 layers of the threads. So as the heat, which is very low, 1200 degrees sounds hot, but for glass it's very low, and it's why this glass is so wonderful, and I can work with it, because if it were normal, this would be happening about 2000 degrees, and that's much more difficult to be working with. So, the glass obviously starts to sink down from the heat. It's starting to not melt, but soften and move. Gravity's a wonderful collaborator in all the work that all glass makers do. It's a very important one. So you see that all these circles are starting to push up against each other, and they're going to flatten out. So the junctions between them, instead of being just these sort of rounded triangular air holes, become hexagonal. But the air hole is also trapped in between. So what happens is 2 things. The light hitting starts refracting in every possible way. Boop, 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 boop. That's why you can't really read a book through these pieces. It's just about refraction of light and the creation, really, of thousands and thousands of tiny prisms. The other thing that it does is, because these long, fine tubes of air are trapped in between these hexagonal shapes, or, vaguely hexagonal shapes, although glass has no, at a molecular level, it has no crystalline structure. It's amorphic. But suddenly, they have a hexagonal shape, and these tubes of air passing through. So the glass starts to have, internally, a linear structure. And it's something that I have to work with and against when I'm creating the forms of my pieces. So it's just a process then of laying out layers and layers and layers and layers of thread, loading it into a kiln, which I worked with kiln makers to design, and then they fabricate it for me, because I'm constantly what we refer to as kiln diving, which means going in and out of the kilns and working at high temperature with lots of stuff on. This is a cool kiln that we're loading it into, sitting over the form that it's first going to be slumped into when it's heated, fused. I take this very quickly with the help of an assistant out of the kiln, and then just scoop up the top and slide it right back on top of this stainless steel form. And with no board to support it, it's going to start slumping down in. So there's the kiln closed. And then this is the same red glass. When it gets very hot, it looks black. And then I start inserting these forms to prescribe an undulating edge, because glass has a great memory. And even if I took these out and it flattened back up, when I start working with it further, those are going to reappear. So there's the transfer. It's very hot. I use very beat-up restaurant spatulas. Restaurant supply houses are my favorite art supply store. I get a lot of great stuff there, including the steel tables, stainless steel rolling tables we work on. There's the second transfer into a deeper and rounder mold, and you see the edge is starting to really go crazy. And you see that we're moving very fast. It's hot. And thanks to actually aerospace industry developing in the 50s and 60s, it's one of the factors that really contributed to the studio glass movement starting in the 60s, because suddenly we had availability to a lot of new refractory materials which insulate from high heat. And they were being mass-produced suddenly, So they became affordable for studio artists to use, to build kilns and furnaces. So this is the first, after the first firing and 2 transfers, this is what the piece looks like. This is Emily doing just some edge cleaning. Then it's, oops, put back in the kiln, now upside down. You see there are those curls in the edge. It's heating up again, so it looks black, and it's starting to, thanks to gravity, starting to move down. Then I can still push it and squeeze it. It's soft enough. And that's the final result. And that piece is about this tall, just to give you an idea. So then I had I've had a few residencies. I never used to want to do residencies. I didn't know why anyone would want to, be away from home and working sort of in isolation. That sounded so uninteresting to me. But then, more recently, it started sounding more interesting for other reasons. Chrysler Museum in Norfolk has a great hot studio. And I was able to kind of revisit those earlier experiments, but this time with much, much finer thread and making very deep meshes. And having a great team of people to work with, because this takes about 6 people to make each one of those pieces. And then as I was about to head to the Chrysler, I suddenly got an email that was very formal from Corning, and it was inviting me to be the 3rd person to participate in this very new program called the Specialty Glass Residency at Corning, and it's a collaboration between Corning's Sullivan Park Research Center, the museum, the library, and the Glass Amphitheater Hot Shop at the museum. I wound up spending most of my time at Sullivan Park. I never thought that I would enjoy being in a totally industrial setting from, basically sunrise till sunset. But I finally actually asked them if they would put a bed in my office. And I looked at them, I said, I'm actually not kidding. And the head of the program said, I know you're not. But it's a very high security. I had to sign 9 pages of confidentiality agreements. A lot of what I did there and was able to work with there and exposed to, I am never allowed to talk about. Some of it I am allowed to talk about, so I'll talk about what I can. So here's the entrance to the museum and the Glass Amphitheater. So this is actually a specialty glass. It has a relationship with Gorilla Glass, which we all know from our smartphones. And that was developed 40 years ago at Corning and was sitting on a shelf until Steve Jobs came along and said, I heard you had some really hard glass. Can we talk about it? And so they developed this miraculous method of making these absolutely perfect sheets, small sheets of glass. For our iPhones, they also developed the incredible process for making the touch screen below. So this is a cousin to that glass. It's very high firing and very hard to blow. So I did it with the blowers at the museum just for fun, just so that they could have a try at it. And we were laughing the whole time because it is so hard to work with. It looks really, really hot. It is really, really hot. And it just is as hard as a rock suddenly. So then we went to the lighter stuff, which was using normal glass. And it was so much easier. And they just kept making them bigger and bigger because they were so happy that they could keep blowing. So the piece is like this tall. I can't even lift it. So that's why it's great to have a great team, because they did all the muscle work. And there I am torch fusing a mat of threads and then laying it over and torching it, which is really defying gravity all the time, because you really need to hold it still to torch something on. But if it's hot enough to torch onto, it's going to want to fall down. So they're great blowers there. So again, just really fascinated with texture and scale. It's always really fun to increase scale. It's a big challenge. So here's part of my team at Sullivan Park, at the research center. And we're actually working in the lab where they produce eagle glass, which is commonly known in the outside world as Gorilla Glass. It fires at about 3,300 degrees. Normal glass that, like you're blowing here at MIT or in any other private studio, is about 2,000 to 2,300. So it's a whole 1,000 degrees hotter. It's so hot that just in order to be in there, we had to have these suits on constantly, and very, very special glasses because the flame is so hot you can't look at it. I wasn't allowed to take any photos myself. That's part of the rules there because there's too much priority equipment and priority things going on. So although it looks like a Georges de la Tour painting and we're working in total darkness, we're not. It was very bright, but in order to be able to photograph the glass and see the shape of it, the photographer had to completely change his settings. So it looks like we're working in darkness. We're not. So it's cooling down a little bit here. It cools so fast. If, as hot as that looks with any other glass, it would still be just running on the floor and just separating. It's already hard as a rock. So it was really interesting to try these experiments to really understand how this very strange glass behaves. So what you see there is a platinum liner, because it's the only thing that will resist this temperature of glass. So we're pulling it apart with rakes, which is something I tried back in the 70s, like in 72 or 71 at RISD, but the glass wasn't strong enough. This glass is very, very strong. It's kind of in the range of family of Pyrex glass, but much farther along. So it has a very, very, very low coefficient of expansion. So you can do a lot of things with it that you can't do with more normal glass. But there are certain things you can't do with it. So here we are just stretching it and stretching it. We're pulling as hard as we can now. You see how hot that looks? And it's rock hard suddenly. So I still love nailing glass to walls. And you can still see the tension in the glass. You can see those sort of stretch marks of tension in it. And it's really, really thin here. It's almost paper thin, but it's so strong, it holds together. And that piece is like this. I was also able to work with laser cut glass. They wanted me to experiment with it, so they would just like dump materials on me, say, just play with it, And one night at the first dinner where I was being introduced to a lot of scientists and engineers, one of the head scientists was there, and he said, well, is there anything we haven't asked you or any questions you have? And I said, yeah, I'm not sure why you invited me here, and I'm just worried that, I'm not going to come up with anything that's going to be of value to you. He said, don't worry about it, just play. We're happy to have you here. So that was so great to hear. So I totally relaxed, and I just played. And so here's Eric Goldschmidt, who's a fantastic flame worker and was a great, great collaborator or assistant or whatever. I'm not sure what I should call him. But here you see these beautiful laser cut, really, really fine sheets, again, of eagle glass. So the flame we're working with is a hydrogen torch. And that, again, is why we had to wear these really special glasses. And one day I put the wrong pair on, and after about a half an hour, I realized I was getting this ocular headache. And then I realized, oh my God, I've got the wrong glasses on. So we had to start being suddenly more kind of like scientific with everything we were doing because we were working with different kinds of glass at the same time. So we had to start labeling everything, and Claire Kelly, who's here, and one of my great team in Providence, and a wonderful artist in her own right, agreed to come up with me, there she is, and help me because I needed an assistant. So here are just some of the early experiments, just slumping this glass to see how it would behave. They were all really behavioral studies in the very beginning, just to know what could be possible with this glass. And it indeed behaved very weirdly. So there's Claire. And me suited up because we're about to go in and start working in the hot shop. So these kilns run hotter than my kilns by a lot because, again, it's very, very high firing glass. And so these were just, tests to see at what temperature the glass would do what. And so the results were, I'm just showing you some of the early things, and the things that fascinated me were just these beautiful, they're almost like details of pieces. But then, my original intent was one thing, and as we started working, and it wasn't until I really saw the photos, although we could see some of it some of the time, I just became really fascinated with the visual imagery that was happening. So I had just wanted to fuse the glass together to do something else with it, but then I became really fascinated with what was happening optically with it. And then, of course, we had to dissect them to find out how they were, what was happening with the fusion and how far up they were fusing. And this wouldn't happen. First of all, we couldn't do this with any other glass because this would have just cracked apart. Secondly, it only, as hot as this whole thing was, it still only was melting right at the very end of it. So we kept I went up and showed David Morse, who says hello to MIT. He was an MIT grad. He's the chief scientist at the center. So I had to go and report to him and show him what I was doing, and I showed him one of those. He goes, "No, now make it life-size." And I went, "Well, he's 6'5" or something. Does that mean life-size?" So I said, "Okay, if you can give me a big enough kiln." So they did a computer search to find out what were the biggest kilns in the facility, and then get permission from that particular scientist or engineer to allow me to come and play in it. So here we are, and I got permission. We were using this, just a small, not even a lathe. We were turning it by hand, but then if I was going to go life-size, whatever that meant, and these are like over 5 feet long, we would need a big lathe to turn it on because we physically couldn't do that. So here we are in, another scientist lent me his lab, and we started working on this huge lathe. And after a while, we're having to sort of keep turning it around because we had this one torch. And I said, well, wait a minute, why aren't we just torching both ends at the same time? Because of the way we could get it into the lathe. So we did. And I don't like flame working. It's sort of, I don't know, I find it a bit daunting. But Eric was great, and he was so relaxed and so knowledgeable. So he taught me how to do it, and we started just working in tandem, which made it possible. And then they invited us back to the hot shop at the museum to demonstrate it to the public, because they have a big public educational program there. So it was great fun. And again, the imagery was so fascinating to me, and watching light and energy curve. It started making me wonder more about how the universe was formed, and where was the energy source? Where does the energy source come from that suddenly creates a star nebula? So Corning is so generous. It has always been incredibly generous to artists. And they made unlimited facilities and unlimited personnel available to me. And they were all really willing and enthusiastic, too. I think they were having more fun than they usually had. So here we are loading the double torched whatevers into these big kilns. So we started at this scale and moved to that scale and then to that scale, which I guess is about 5.5 feet long, 6 feet. So the next process was to start just slumping them. And what you're seeing here are actually catalytic converters that were flawed. So one of the scientists came down one day and he said, maybe you could use this to make a form with. And I went, okay. And he wheels me in this whole cart of these catalytic converter blanks, which turned out to be perfect. One of the scientists came up with this brilliant idea. Instead of having them machined, he just took a glass rod and wrapped some sandpaper around it because it was going to take a week, and we didn't have that much time. And he just sort of sanded these perfect curves in them for me. He came in it was his own idea. He spent the whole weekend doing it and making multiple forms for me. I mean, they were more than wonderful there. I can't say enough good things about the people I worked with. So here we are starting. You have to keep these supported, otherwise they would just not behave properly, and keep taking out their supports until finally, I was getting these shapes that I wanted. And obviously it starts as a cylinder or a mass, but a round mass. But because the middle part is all still separate, big kind of threads, it starts to splay apart. So this is the last week I was there. Lots of work. We were able to work in 5 kilns at once. One of them had a fracture on the end, so another kiln was made available to me, and one of the engineers just drilled a hole in the top of the kiln, and we figured out this way to suspend it and keep lowering this ceramic support, so really high fire sort of glass ceramic support. And you see there it's starting to lower, and as the heat starts soaking into it, it's starting to curve. So we had to keep lowering the support, and that's how hot the kiln is. It's much hotter than my kilns. So you can see there's the piece starting to curve, but then suddenly it just curved itself, and it came out of the support. So the same scientists who had, formed those molds for me out of the catalytic converters the next day sent me this on my email. I started to laugh and thought, not only I haven't even gotten to reinventing a wheel here, I'm still back at Reed boats. But that was the kind of delightful, playful relationship and an incredible encyclopedic knowledge that all the people I was working with there had. So I just came back to my own studio with enormous amounts of material. They were extraordinarily generous, and just started playing, making these spatial, sculptural objects, movable objects. And I'm still not sure what I'm going to do or where I'm going to take these, but I also discovered that as soon as I was back in my own studio, after such an intense work period at Corning, it didn't matter. As soon as, because this happened over a period of 6 months, as soon as I walked back in my own studio, this kind of Pavlovian dog response happened, and it was like immediately clicked back to the work I had been doing before in my own studio. So I realized in order to change that, I'm going to have to take a new studio space that's empty and void of all, recollection of my past work. I was able to just begin to work with this very special glass, which is a glass that has a high sensitivity to the quality of light that's being shown on it. So what you're seeing here is exactly the same glass there. We just changed the light. So one is incandescent, one's fluorescent. So it's a very special glass. I was shown it, but I was told I wasn't going to be able to work with it when I first arrived at the end of January. And then in April, I kind of asked about it again. I said, gee, I wish I could work with that glass, even here, even just to try it. And the scientist that was working with it came and found me, and he said, I just got the patent on it. You can. So, but I didn't have time to. So they actually pulled it into glass rods, which is quite a big deal if you knew the process, and sent it home with me. So I'm intending to play with that soon. This is some super, super, super fine glass thread that they spun onto spools for me. And when we were moving it, it just sort of fell off the spool and took this, just fell into, an infinity, the shape of an infinity symbol. And I kept looking at it going, and it made me really start thinking about like infinity and what is that? And we just sort of talk about it like we know what it is, or we've grasped the concept of infinity, but what if it is constantly fraying? What if infinity is constantly fraying in order to make way for everything new that's evolving in the universe. So all in all, it was a tremendous experience for me to be there. But I did get back to my own work in my own studio. And that's where I am right now. So thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
How long does it usually take for you to make one of these pieces?
Like that?
Yeah.
It takes over 2 weeks.
Whoa.
And that's really involving everyone in my studio. My whole team's here minus one. Would you guys please stand up? Because I really have to thank you. Nancy, Nicole Ross, Mama Schaefer, Claire Kelly, Joe Upham, you stand up too. I couldn't do this without you. Joe has very generously, he was the director at New York Experimental Glass when I joined it, which you all now know as Urban Glass. And Joe has very generously taken over after Matthias passed away in 2007 in the maintenance of the electronics of the machines, because I am clueless. So thank you. Thank you all. So it's a long process. As you saw from the slides, the initial firings, because the pieces are getting bigger, and I can't transfer without risking myself, my assistant, and the piece itself cracking, because the weight is so great, but it still has to be at a certain temperature, so it just became unrealistic to keep trying to be energy efficient, although my kilns are very energy efficient. So it means they can heat up. You can't thermal shock thread. So they heat up and fuse in 3.5 hours, but then they have to cool down. These take 24 hours to cool down in the first phase. It's flat. And then once they're fused, in order to heat them back up again so that they'll slump, it takes another, like, overnight from 6 at night till 8 the next morning, so that we don't risk cracking it. And then there's the slumping process that has to take place. It takes a few hours because it goes slowly. And then again, the cooling time becomes even longer. And then again, once it's turned upside down in the kiln and hung over a form with a lot of jigging around it, it takes about 14 hours to bring it up, and then it's 3 hours, 3.5 hours, very active, constant in and out of the kiln work time to get the forms right. And then it takes a day and a half, 2 days to cool it down. And that doesn't even count the laying out of it or the pulling of the threads. So altogether, if I were to start today with glass rods and have enough pulled to make enough to make that piece, then lay it out and put it through all the firings, it would be 3 weeks from now. But because we're constantly, rolling, once we get rolling, we're making more pieces, and they're in different kilns doing different things. So we have multiple things going on at once. So it's a longer process than I ever intended to be. It's kind of the opposite of glass, which usually goes so much faster.
So none of the pieces you showed had a lot of cold work done to it. Is that because it's difficult to do with this kind of fibrous structure, or?
Yeah, it just like.
You can't?
Well, there's so many of these air tubes running through it that it really starts to like crunch and shatter. So I can't even use a diamond point to sign them, which is usually how glass is signed. So luckily my name is a Z, so you can actually melt the glass with a match and make a little lampwork, a little Z out of it, and it's fused. It's the first thing that goes down on the board when I'm making it. So it's sort of like Zorro, I like that. And Z is a very easy one to do. If it were something else, it would be more difficult. But that's a good question. The other cold working, and part of the reason, actually backing up a little bit, that the evolution of my work took the path it did, was not only I was more interested in seeing what kinds of voluminous kinds of work I could do when I was combining glass blowing and all those masses of fused threads, was that I caught my hand in an upright grinding machine. And I really didn't think I was going to have a hand left when I pulled it out. And I did serious damage to it. Luckily it's okay, but that was it. That was the last time I ever cold worked anything. And I figured anything that moves that much faster than I do, I don't need it. And it really started me like working away from having to do that kind of work on a piece. And I still don't like it. So the only thing that, there's some hand working with fine diamond files that goes on at the end, a lot of cleaning and just, washing and stuff. And then just a touch down on a diamond wheel, which someone else does. Usually, sometimes I have to do it, but just to get that bottom perfectly flat. And it's such a fine diamond that it doesn't like chew up anything.
You show first image about Hubble's telescope glass. Do you get inspiration from cosmos, like black hole, like we are in the golden age of the astrophysics, discovering new color? Do you think about that one? This is perfectly will be inspiration like black holes working, something like that, on quasars, something like that one.
I mean, I've always been fascinated with outer space. And had a lot of conversations about it with Dr. Billy Ransom growing up. It just became part of my knowledge in my childhood. And actually, when I look at all the colors I have, there was a point when I was looking at all my colors going, there must be another color, and I have every color on the planet that we know of, but I keep looking and going, there must be another color. Somewhere, we think the spectrum is what we have, but there must be other colors. So I do wonder about the universe and think, out there's probably other colors. It's hard for us to imagine it. Like it's hard to conceive of what infinity means, but there must be. And anything to do with energy and hot stuff spinning around, I like it, No, I'm fascinated with the universe. Does anybody else have a question?
I'm fortunate enough to have one of your pieces.
No, thank you.
It is a beautiful black and red. It's a much taller and tulip-shaped form. And I'm wondering how you get inspiration for changing the forms and doing more manipulation, and how does that process all get into your head?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I can answer it.
The forms were more simple when you started.
They were, and part of when I started working with just fusing and slumping, because I didn't really want to blow and polish and grind anymore, I looked at what had been done, and there really wasn't much in the way of, using it as an art form that had been done with slumped glass. And a couple whose last name is Higgins did some early work with fusing and slumping, but it was just very simple, shallow. And then I saw a few things that were just like, totally random. And I went, no, that's not good enough either. There must be a better way. There must be a way to get there. And so I started experimenting. I just started working at it and trying to figure it out. And I realized that before I could ever get to more elaborated forms that were more of what I wanted, I would first have to figure out how to make a perfectly symmetrical, round form. I would have to get to that. And it's a process that involves kind of moving glass slowly. So it has time to stretch and compress so that the bottom actually does get thicker and the sides get thinner. I was actually surprised when I did some early experiments at how much it was stretching. If you measure the diameter, it was a big difference.
Yeah.
So I started learning from it. And then when I started turning them upside down to get taller forms, to use gravity to just do all the hard work, the first one was working, and then it wasn't enough, and I left the kiln going, hotter and longer. And the next time I opened the kiln, which was really only about 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, I had a nasty surprise. I mean, there was just this, sort of disc of glass with these fine little threads of glass connecting it still to the rest of the piece, which was down at the bottom of the kiln. So I got it. I had to add more material in order to make taller forms so that it would have enough to stretch and not just get paper thin. So part of it is just, it's just about working and playing and looking at what happens every day and going, that's not really enough. I want to go further and pushing it further and further. And it's a challenge. When I was at RISD, there was no curriculum per se in the glass department. I actually think that was a great thing. We had to make up our own problems. We had to, Dale would just say, go to the library and, look at books, look at look at architecture, look at sculpture, look at paintings. Don't just try and look at glass. There's so much more to do with this material. And so we had to make up our own problems and then figure out how to solve them. And so I think I've sort of functioned all my life that way with my work. And things happen. The great collaborator in all of this is the glass itself. I've had people who collaborated with me on different things, but the great collaborator is the material itself, and glass is an extraordinary collaborator. It has a lot we still don't know about it. And so it's always a feeling of there's so much more to discover that it kind of drives me, even when I go in and I go, I want to go to the beach today, actually. I don't want to work. And you just force yourself to work, you just start doing one thing and it leads to, and do it step by step and just keep then thinking and, making your brain work. And sometimes it's also about not working. I'm a big believer in daydreaming. I don't think kids these days have enough opportunity or time to daydream or free play. I learned so much. I still remember some of the things that I suddenly started to understand just lying in the grass and looking up at a bunch of trees, or watching the clouds go by and wondering why they were different shapes, or why when I closed my eyelids, I would see red, and all those great things that there's a lot of things to wonder about. So I wish I had more daydream time. That is my idea of luxury these days, is just to have more time to daydream.
To me, that piece is the piece I always dreamed of yours of having. Do you see yourself pushing this particular form even more with more?
Yeah, I'm almost done with these. There are more issues that I have with it and go, why is it going like that? And I want it to go like that, or I wish it was more like this or that. And so I have to work it out. The next time I go in, I have to figure it out and try it. And sometimes it works, or sometimes it almost works, but I'm getting farther there.
Do different colors? You said at the beginning you had issues with the colors and compatibility. Is your glass now such that you could make that in lots of different colors like you did at the beginning?
Yeah, I could.
You could.
The compatibility problems that I was having were based on ignorance and not speaking Italian. So when I got to Italy for the first time and followed the directions, like, you go down the Fundamenta Vitrai, you go over the last bridge, you walk along the quay, and you come to Milette. And that's where I get the glass rods. So I did that. And I started, brought it back to Holland. Matthias and I worked together for almost 25 years, developing more and more sophisticated thread pulling machines. But I got back to Holland and I started, we pulled the threads, I started fusing them, and every day they broke. And I'd say, okay, maybe I'm not cooling them down long enough, maybe I'm not heating them up the right way, maybe I should change the material I'm making, the forms I'm slumping into, or what. And it just, finally I'd run out of options. And I've been chasing Johnny Toso by telephone around America, where he was doing like a tour. And he finally called me back one day. It was the day I was like, I'm done. I'm just going to do something else. This isn't working. I have to give up. And he called literally that day, and I burst into tears. He said, what's the matter? I said, everything's breaking. And he said, well, tell me what you're doing with it. So I told him, and he said, that's right, that's right. That's okay, the annealing time's fine. No, that material is fine. Everything was fine. And I'm going, okay, that's all fine. Why is it breaking? And he was silent for a minute, and he said, oh, what Moretti did you go to? And I walked down the Fundamental Vitae, went over the last bridge, walked along the quay, came to Moretti, and they had all this cane. And he said, oh no, you have to go to the second Moretti. So I had to go back to Venice, which was really torture, and went to the right Moretti, and came back and did the same thing I'd been doing with it, and it all worked. So, yeah, applaud for Moretti because they existed for 400 years. As Moretti, they were the largest supplier of mosaics to the entire world, and it's why they developed literally thousands of colors. Every shade and tone of every color you can imagine. Like 800 shades of green or something. And the most pure and beautiful. And part of the reason that those colors are so pure and beautiful is because they are low fire. Like, do you know the difference between low fire and high fire ceramics? Lower fire ceramics have the prettier colors, and higher fire ceramics don't because that kind of heat burns color out. And there are some similarities there's a broader range in glass, but it's part of the reason that they have so many beautiful colors and that I can work with them because it's also low fire. Because those colors were developed back in the days before they had gas and oxygen air, fired furnaces. They were firing with wood. They burned down the virgin forest of the whole coast of Yugoslavia to fire the furnaces of Venice, sadly. So, question?
Yeah, I was curious whether you've been able to execute that plan that you talked about of setting up a whole nother studio so that you could, work with a clean slate.
I'm working on it.
Really excited to see what comes next.
So am I. So am I, and I plan to probably not bring a computer, not bring a cell phone, nothing. Just a nice blank slate to work in. I think I've always, without planning to or realizing it, I started looking at dates and I realized I've actually moved my studio every 5 years since I started having studios. And, because a landlord went bankrupt, because I had to move, for many reasons. It's been every 5 years. That's a lot of moving. But the positive thing about it is that every time you move, first of all, everyone in the studio suddenly is functioning in a different way together and interacting in a different way. It just changes, suddenly you have an interruption. And then, you reset up, you're in a different space, you're in a different neighborhood, your path to work is different. When you walk outside, it's different. Your walls are different. Where everything is located in the studio is different. So that affects your brain a lot. And I think it sort of kickstarts it again, but in a different way. And so I think it's been really important and really advantageous. I can't actually imagine staying in the same studio my whole life. It's like, what am I still doing here? There's a big world out there. And I also love to travel. There is a big world out there, and it is gorgeous. And it's easy to forget how wondrous the rest of the world is, and people in different cultures are, and music and food. And it's like, what am I doing here? So I'm looking forward to it too. But it takes time. I mean, when Corning called me or emailed me, I have a schedule that's 2 years rolling forward all the time. And I kind of stopped the music for Corning for 6 months because it was just a fabulous opportunity. I would come back at regular intervals to my studio, but working like a madwoman. So I'm still on the momentum of that schedule before I can do that, although I have already been looking for spaces. I just haven't found the right one. I have a very specific idea of what it should be, so I may have to wind up building it.
I was surprised to hear you say that you were daunted by flame working, and I wanted to hear you speak more about that.
The reason I'm daunted by flame working was particularly because we were working with hydrogen torches. Those are hydrogen torches. I mean, you can't look at them, and they're super powerful, and they were, broad, so it's a lot of energy coming out of those. I mean, and if they pop out, when you're lighting them, they really, bang! And I never got used to that. Every time that happened, I was jumping back, and Eric had to do it. I said, I can't do this, I mean, it was great what they do, but they're so bright, and the heat is so intense. But it was really the incredible power of them, and it's a real forceful blast. It's not like regular oak flame working. That's why. But then you get fascinated enough by what you're doing that you kind of go, okay, I've got to, just do that because it's making this happen, and that's what I want to happen. Question?
I was just curious, in developing the process of doing that type of piece, if, as you were kiln diving, if you ever did bring a hand torch into the kiln with you.
Very good question. And I discovered something about energy and flames that I didn't know before, because I wanted to add something in the way that I added with a torching on when I was blowing glass. So I thought, I think I want to try that on this piece. But as soon as you go into an environment that hot in a kiln, it pops the flame back out. It just shuts it down. So then I thought, okay, I need a flame that moves faster and hotter than this. So we got an acetylene torch. And that is so hot and so specific and so focused and pointed that it was just burning holes in the glass. There was no way to modify that. I'd still like to find a way, though. I imagine that the trouble is when I take a piece, when I'm transferring pieces out of the kiln, it's a few seconds. It's quick, but you still have a little bit of time. And so it would be possible to torch it out of the kiln, but the time it would take to do whatever you were doing with that torch, the rest of the piece would be likely to thermal shock and break, unless you were to develop kind of a ring burner of torches that would keep a whole environment hot enough so that you could go in with the other torch, but still you're out in the air. It'd be worth a try. Did I answer your question? And I'm sure that there's a temperature differential where it could work. If the kiln were just at a lower temperature and the flame were just hot enough that it would override the temperature inside the kiln, you could probably make it work. But when when the interior of the kiln is hotter than the flame, it immediately just pops it back out. Any other questions?
And we're on it for the glass conference.
I'm considering doing that. So we'll see. I'll probably go. It's a great place.